Today's date is January 26th, 2024. My name is Kelly Zakovic, and I'm representing the City of Savannah Municipal Archives. I'm interviewing Lester Johnson III for the Savannah Community Memory Project. We are conducting this interview at the Liberty City Community Center. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling us about your community.
Be happy to. I'm Lester Benjamin Johnson III, the son of Lester Benjamin Johnson Jr. and the son of Constance Marquita Mosley Johnson, and the grandson of Lester Benjamin Johnson Sr. and his wife, Lucille Baldwin Johnson. Born December the 4th, 1953, at 214 East Park Avenue in Savannah. That's where we lived at the time. My dad lived with his mom, who was Lucille Baldwin Johnson. His dad, my grandfather, died when my dad was a freshman in college, and he attended what was called then Hampton Institute, which is now called Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. Daddy decided to move out to Liberty City. He said he bought one lot, cost $500. That lot was on what was then 1905 West 54th Street. It then became 1905 Darrow Street, D-A-R-R-O-W, and then it ultimately became 1905 Fitzgerald Street. And the Fitzgerald, of course, for those who are kind of younger, was the president's middle name, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And as a lot of people know, he was a well-respected president, loved by a lot of African Americans, and so they decided they would name it after him, the whole name, but it ended up being just the Fitzgerald given to that name. I was 2 years old when Daddy decided to buy the lot. And when I got older, I asked Daddy, why didn't you buy more lots, like a developer does? And he said, son, if you knew what it took to buy that one lot, he said $500 back in those days, that would have been in 1955. It was rough, and it was hard to come up with that $500. Daddy was a school teacher. He taught at what was then called Cala Beach High School. And he came directly from college. He graduated from Hampton in 1949 and came directly to Savannah to apply to become a mechanical drawing instructor. That's what they called it back in those days. So those are people who wanted to ultimately be an architect. Daddy wanted to be an architect, but because his daddy died when he was a freshman in college, he promised his mother that he would come back to Savannah and help her out financially, which is what he did. He and my mother, believe it or not, she was a student at the New Beach High School. She was in the first graduating class at Alfred Eli Beach High School on Hopkins Street. Cala Beach was over on Anderson Street. So when they built the new school, Daddy, of course, was a teacher there, and my mother and my aunts and uncles were students there. And so because of the taboo, Daddy could not date her until she went to college, which she did down at Xavier University in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And the summer she came home, they started dating, and that was the end of it. He convinced her that he loved her so much that she shouldn't return to Xavier and she should marry him, and that's what she did. Mm-hmm. And so my sister came along first in 1952, and then I came along in 1953. My mother was a Catholic, and as a lot of people know, Catholics did not believe in birth control back in those days. And so 2 children right off the bat after they got married. And then Daddy decided, because my mother said she was tired of not being able to cook and clean, because my grandmother did all the cooking and all the cleaning. And she said, you know, I'm your wife, but I can't do anything. So my dad said, well, let's try to go ahead and build our own house so that we can live as a family, and, you know, I can just check on my mother off and on. So he and 3 other gentlemen, Mr. Johnny Paul Jones, Mr. Pennington, who was a brick mason, Mr. Ira Williams, who was also a brick mason, and my dad built the house, which still sits at 1905 Fitzgerald Street, from the ground up. And it was a cinder block house that was built. And we would go out with him and watch them build. I remember distinctly that there were snakes that we had to deal with. There were what they call wood rats, which are real big rats that didn't want you coming into their territory. And so we finally got the house built and moved into the house. And my sister and I, and my mom and my dad. Back in those days, we were in the county. We were not in the city limits, and the streets were dirt, and we had to have septic tanks. And of course, as a young boy, we didn't know what a septic tank really was, to be honest with you, until my dad forgot to get the septic tank company to come in, pull all of that out, and it started coming up through the bathtub and the shower and those kind of things. And of course, that's when we learned, oh, that's what that septic tank is about. But I remember them coming, and after we found out what was going into the septic tank, and saying, how can those guys have a career cleaning out septic tanks? And then, of course, we were one of the first families in Liberty City. There weren't a lot of families then, but then as we got older, more families started buying lots and building homes. And before you knew it, we had a lot of children, all the same ages, in Liberty City, and we played things like touch football. We played what's called half rubber. A lot of people didn't know about half rubber, but half rubber was actually discovered here in Savannah. And basically you took a rubber ball and cut it in half, and you got your mama's old mop stick, and then one person would throw it, and then you would have a person to catch it, and then you would try to hit that ball, and depending on how far you hit it would be first base, second base, third base, fourth base, and then that would be 1 run, and etc. And it was the same as baseball, 3 outs, you out, and then somebody else comes up and pitches. So we played that. We also played the rock game. Wasn't really rocks, but when it rained out here because of the dirt streets, and when the sun would dry, we would get these rocks, what we call rocks, but it was basically sand, and they would harden, and you would just cut it out, and then we would throw that dirt at each other. So that was another game we played. And then, of course, Dr. Cooper, who was a local dentist, he decided to build a basketball court in his backyard. And that basketball court became basically the playground for all the boys in Liberty City. And then we also played regular baseball, and so we had a very physical type of upbringing. We couldn't have skates because you can't skate on dirt, and there were no sidewalks. So we had to wait to go to my grandmother's house on East Park Avenue in order to skate. And all of us would get skates on Christmas. They called them Union No. 5 skates. And you would get them, they would fit right over your shoes. And then we would go on East Park Avenue where they had sidewalks, and we would skate. The other thing that we did was we would build our own scooters. We would take a 2x4 and that would be the bottom. And then you would get old skates that you didn't use anymore, and you put that on the bottom of the 2x4. Then you got another 2x4 to be the base. And then you would get knee-high grape cola tops and knee-high orange tops and RC cola tops, and you would decorate the scooter with those soda tops. And so again, we couldn't ride those in Liberty City because of the dirt. So we had to take those with us over to East Park Avenue and also ride that. So we had our lifestyle back then, this would have been in the early 50s, was all about being outside and then creating our own games and our own fun. The other thing that we did, which again, somebody, unless you were born in the 50s, would know about, is we made pluffers. A pluffer was, you took, you had to ask your mama for an old hose, a water hose. And you had to hope that she had an old water hose. Because if she didn't have an old water hose, you could not have a pluffer. So thank goodness we had an old water hose, and she let me cut it. So you would cut it maybe about 4 inches. Then you would get a stick, and you would bam the bottom of the stick and have it, it would be like suction. You want to make sure that the cylinder of the stick could fit into the hose and build up the pressure. Then you would go next door to your neighbor. In our case, that was Mrs. Brown, Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Mary Brown was her name. She was a school teacher, and her husband's name was Lucius Brown, and he was a postal carrier. And they had a chinaberry tree. So you had to go over and ask them, could you get some chinaberries? You take the chinaberries and stick it at the end of the hose, and then you build up pressure with that stick, and then those chinaberries would come out, and they would get all over your clothes. And we called them pluffers. And then my dad, because he was good at woodwork, he would build us slingshots made out of wood. And so we had slingshots and pluffers, and it was a great childhood. We never got bored, because everything we did was outside, and it was always that. In addition to that, back in those days, we all had chores. Didn't matter whether you were a boy or girl, you had chores. So I had to wash dishes, I had to take out the trash, I had to mop, I had to clean the yard, cut the grass, all of that. And back then we didn't have gas lawnmowers, we had those push mowers. So you can see that we grew up really having a lot of physical exercising and physical movements. The other good thing about having neighbors like the Browns was that they didn't have children. They were the first people on Fitzgerald Street to buy a color TV. So remember now, back in our day in the 50s, we had black and white TVs, and we had 2 channels. We ended up with 3, but we had initially 2 channels. When they got the first color TVs, there was only 2 programs you could watch in color: Bonanza and Walt Disney World of Colors. And so every Sunday, the Browns would ask my parents, can Lil Lester and Joyce come to our house to watch Bonanza and the World of Color, Disney World of Color. And we loved it. We loved going over there and watching that in color. Because a lot of children were growing up in Savannah, in Liberty City, not Savannah, in Liberty City, we had a long list of friends in all parts. I mean, Liberty City started out from Millsby Lane, which obviously is still here, and then Fitzgerald Street was the first street, and then the next street after that was Lloyd, then Tuskegee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they developed Liberty City just like they develop subdivisions now. you know, you do it in phases. And so it took a long time for Fitzgerald Street to really get families on both sides. The west side of Liberty Parkway is the 1900 block, and the east side of Liberty Parkway is the 1800 block. As I mentioned earlier, our family was Catholic, and my dad was the sole breadwinner in the family. So Daddy taught at Beach High School. Back in those days, we're talking again in the 50s, black school teachers who worked for the public school system made half of the salary of white school teachers. So because Daddy was not making a lot of money, he had to have 4 other jobs. So Daddy was the broadcaster for all the football games, all the high school football games, and they paid him, I don't know how much he got, but they paid him to do that. Then he also ran the clock for all the high school basketball games. And then he would do the starter pistol for the track meets, and he would do one other job. I can't remember what the other job was. So that was one job. The second job he had was working at the morning news. Nowadays, everything is mechanized. But back in the early 50s, when, you know, all these little sale things that come out, you had to put those in the regular paper, and they called it inserters. So Daddy was the head inserter, and his job was to hire as many people as he needed to make sure that all those ads got put in the regular paper so that they can get out to the people the next day. So that was job number 2. Job number 3, he took photographs for a guy named Sam Williams, who owned what's called the Vanity Shop. And the Vanity Shop sold records, and they also developed photographs. So Daddy would go to all the proms at the, we had 3 black high schools at the time: Beach High School, Johnson High School, and Tompkins High School. So Daddy would go to those proms, take photographs, and then they would charge, of course, for the package. You know, if you want to get 1 5x7, et cetera, et cetera. I would go with him to take the orders. So it was a way for me to be a part of his life, but also to see that he had to do all these extra jobs just to, for us to have a decent life. And his 4th job was drawing plans. Dad, went to school to become an architect. He couldn't become an architect because he needed to come home and to take care of his mom. But also for historical purposes, he couldn't become an architect because in order to take the AIA exam as a black person, you had to do an apprenticeship with a white architect for 10 years before you could take the exam. So he obviously couldn't do that because he had to help his mom out. So Dad knew how to draw plans, so he drew plans for a lot of people. Sidney A. Jones Funeral Home, for example, he drew the plans for that. And people would hire him to draw plans. He probably drew plans for most of the houses out here in Liberty City. And but the thing that I like to tell people about is that Daddy was very ingenious. He could not get the city or the county to seal the plans. So he met a white architect named John Stacy, S-T-A-C-Y. John Stacy was the father of Hollis Stacy, who was a female golfer who became well known. And he's also the father of Gilbert Stacy, who was an attorney in town who is retired now. But Mr. Stacy lived on Wheaton Street, and we would go to his house every Saturday. And I would wonder why, but my dad would take me with him. And so I think one day I just said, Daddy, why do we have to go to Mr. Stacy's house all the time? He said, well, son, I can't submit an architectural drawing to the county. They won't approve it. So I have to get a white architect to seal the plans, and Mr. Stacy has agreed to do that for me. So they had a long-term relationship where Daddy would draw the plans, take them to Mr. Stacy, he would review them, seal them, and then he would turn them over to the homeowner and they would go ahead and build their house. So that's kind of the lifestyle that we lived. My dad wanted us to go to Catholic schools, so we all went to Catholic schools. Back in those days, we went to a school called St. Mary's. It was on 36th Street and Ogeechee Road in the Ogeechiton neighborhood. And several people out in Liberty City also went to St. Mary's. So my mom we would have a carpool. My mom would pick us up because we only had one car. So she would go get Daddy, bring him home, and then go pick us up. And in the morning, we would go with someone else. And we did that for all the 8 years that we went to St. Mary's. And so and we did that for a lot of things, not only for going to school, but going to parties, going to football games, basketball games. We did a lot of carpooling back in those days. And that's just the way families were run and what have you. So Fitzgerald Street became a very popular street because a lot of teachers, when they found out that Daddy had built a house, they say, well, we're gonna buy a lot and build a house as well. So Miss Brown was a teacher. She was right next door to us. To our east was the Lockhart family. Mr. Lockhart worked on the railroad, and his wife was a domestic. She worked in a home. Across the street from us were the Dingle family. Both of them were teachers. And then directly across the street from us were the Jones family. Mr. Johnny Paul Jones was a police officer. He was one of the first black police officers in Atlanta, not in Savannah, but in Atlanta. Then he came to Savannah and worked at the Housing Authority. His wife was a nurse, a public health nurse. Her name was Parnell Jones, and they were right across the street from us. And then next to them were teachers. Oh boy, I'm going to be challenging myself. I can't think of their name, but anyway, they were teachers. And then next to them was a guy that worked at what was called back in those days Union Bag, and that was the Clay family. But his wife was a teacher. And then across the street was another family, and the wife in that family was a teacher as well. So pretty much that entire street was either teachers or persons who had fairly decent jobs, to be honest with you, back in those days. And we all knew each other. We all played in each other's homes. Back in those days, you had to be home before sunset. If you didn't get home, you're gonna get a spanking. They did not spare the rod back in those days. We got beat pretty badly if we didn't do things that we were told to do. And then of course, I went off to school. After I left St. Mary's, I went to Benedictine. I was one of the first black students out there, along with another person from Liberty City named Solomon Myers. He went to BC as well. And so that was a little tough because, I was going to a school that was predominantly white. Most of my friends who lived out here at that time, everybody that lived in Liberty City went to Beach High School. They changed ultimately and they redistricted the Liberty City, and those students started going to Windsor Forest when Windsor Forest was built. And so people like Estella Shabazz, who's on city council, she actually went to Windsor and graduated from Winston along with her husband. But everybody else before that time that lived in Liberty City went to Beach and graduated from Beach High School. But it was a great time for us. We enjoyed being with children around here. The families, everybody looked out for one another. Miss Lockhart didn't have children, which was another odd thing about Miss Brown didn't have children, Miss Lockhart didn't have children, and the Jones didn't have children. But they all looked out for us, and we would go to their homes all the time. Miss Lockhart was a great baker. She would bake these 7-layer cakes that, oh my gosh, we would just be praying that please offer us a slice of that cake. But it was a great childhood and a great place to grow up. I tell my children all the time that, they think because we grew up during segregation that we didn't have a good childhood, but we had a wonderful childhood, and I'll never forget it. Never forget it. The other thing that I will share with you for historical purposes is back in those days they used what's called the chain gang to clean out the ditches, and it was a little I won't say upsetting, but it did upset us because all the people on the chain gang were black, but the guy over them was white, and he was on a horse, and he had a shotgun. And our parents would always tell us, we would say, well, why do they have a shotgun, Daddy? And he said, well, son, if one of those guys on the chain gang tries to escape, they're gonna shoot him. And so we were always, when we would see them, we were like, please don't anybody try to escape today. We do not want to see anybody get shot. But it was a very unsettling thing that we saw. And they brought them out a lot because every time it rained in Liberty City, it was bad. And so they would bring them out a lot to dig the ditches so that they would have a place for that water to go when we had heavy rains and what have you. Let's see, the only other thing that I'd like to share for historical purposes is that it probably was one of the first times that a group of black families organized to get things done. The two things that everybody always talked about was we gotta get paved streets and we gotta get connected to the sewer lines. We cannot continue to live like this. And then the third thing was we want to be annexed into the city, and which happened. I tell people that we felt like we really lived in the suburbs because we had to pay for a trash pickup. And there was a guy in the community, Mr. Wynn, who lived out here and who had a trash pickup service. And I remember us having to pay him every week to pick up our trash. So that's something that, you don't find a lot with black families having to say, well, we had to pay for our own trash pickup, by the way, and our own septic tank cleaning and that type of thing as well. So, but it was a great place to grow up. The house that my dad built with his own 2 hands still is there. My mom comes back and forth and lives there. She doesn't stay there all the time because we don't want to, stay in that big house. By the way, Daddy ended up putting a second story on the house because we ended up with 5 children in the family. When it was just the 2 of us, we only needed that 1-story house, but after the family started growing, Daddy added a second story to the house, and it still exists and still is right there on Fitzgerald Street. But yeah, we really enjoyed growing up here. There's a lot of other stories I could share with you, but I hope that the other people who will be giving presentations will include some of the things that they remembered about growing up in the Liberty City that I may have forgotten about.
Well, thank you. Do you mind if I ask a few follow-up questions?
Certainly.
Okay, so working backwards, the chain gang that came out, do you know how How, like, until when did they?
Oh, it
do
was, I remember seeing the chain gang out there throughout our elementary school career. I don't remember them when I went to BC. So I went to BC in 1967. So I think around that time with the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, they kind of got rid of those chain gangs. But I remember them through, from first grade to 8th grade.
You mentioned Dr. Cooper's yard, and you had your basketball court. Where did he live?
He lived on Millsby Lane, but his backyard backed into Fitzgerald Street. So that's why you use that yard. But his name was Dr. Philip Cooper, and he was a dentist. And he had one child who is alive and is still practicing dentistry, and his name is Philip Cooper Jr. We all called him Wendell back in those days. Now he goes by Phil, but everybody in Liberty City called Wendell, which was his middle name, Philip Wendell Cooper Jr. And he was married to a lovely woman named Agatha Cooper, and she was a tremendous person. We really liked Mrs. Cooper, but that's where we played basketball, in the backyard. But they lived on Millsby Lane, and I think he built that house from the ground up as well.
And which side?
He's that would be on the west side of Liberty Parkway, and the house is still there. They sold it. Dr. Cooper died first, and then his wife lived to be about, I think she was almost 100 when she died. And Wendell has 2 children. One is Denise Cooper, who is an assistant city attorney. So when I talk about Dr. Cooper, that was her grandfather and her grandmother. And then she has a brother named Tony Cooper, and so I tease her a lot about, the fact that, we played in your grandparents' backyard, and thank God for them, because other than that, we would not have had a basketball goal to play on. Just wasn't many recreational things back in those days for us.
Did you live in Liberty City after you left for college?
I would come home. I came home, I think pretty much every summer, because I worked for the Morning News one summer. I worked at M&M Supermarket in high school. That was the predecessor to Kroger. Kroger bought out M&M, but M&M was owned by the Malava family. And I went to work for them as a bag boy, and I was a stock boy and a cashier. And so then when I went off to college, I came back, worked for the Morning News one summer, stayed up north and worked one summer for UPS. Made more money at UPS than I'd ever made in my life. And then one summer I came back and worked for, oh gosh, who did I work for that summer? Cannot remember. I might have gone back to M&M and worked as a cashier. But yeah, so we came back, and then of course after college, I went to law school down at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida, and we would come to visit. So there's never been a time where we've not had a connection with Liberty City. And then I moved back to Savannah in 1980, and we built a home out in Coffee Bluff. But the house has always been that unit that everybody has always come back to when we come back home to visit.
How has Liberty City changed?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of renters in Liberty City now. Back in our days, everybody owned their home. I can't remember anybody renting a house back in those days. So now you got a lot of renters. People took pride in their homes and their yards. We didn't need code enforcement back in my day because we were our own code enforcers. Now, code enforcement comes out here regularly to make sure that people clean up their yard and get rid of derelict vehicles and all that kind of stuff. And then there doesn't seem to be that community tie that we had. I was telling Donna Myers that in order to go play with my friends who lived on Upson Street, we had to get permission. And we're only talking about 5 blocks. But we had to get permission to go to Upson Street to play with the Mincy boys. It was Leon Mincy, Patricia Mincy, and their brother's his nickname was Shrimp because he was so short. To this day, I don't know what his real name is because we still call him Shrimp. But that's the way it was. You had to get permission to go, and then they knew where you were at all times. There wasn't any time that we went somewhere that they didn't know where we were. And so those things have changed. We never locked our doors at night when we went to bed. They never got locked. And so that has obviously changed a lot. But I think now on Liberty, on Fitzgerald Street, the Lockhart's relatives live in that house, and they've always looked out for my parents. The Dingles died, both of the Dingles died, and that house is being rented out. But we still have a relationship with the daughter, whose name is Marcia Lee Johnson now. And she lives in Hilton Head, but we still keep up with her. And William Clay, who lived down 4 houses down, he has moved back to Savannah. They own a house down there, but it's kind of dilapidated and they're trying to refurbish it. But he's back in town now. So, and Tyrone Smith is back in town. So some of the people that I grew up with and played with, they're moving back to Savannah. Not to Liberty City, but back to Savannah. And their parents still own the homes, and some of them have inherited those homes as well.
Okay, so 2 more questions. My second to last question. Do you have an absolute favorite memory that you'd like to share with us?
Let's see. I guess it would have been, Yep, and it's kind of a funny story. We had Easter egg hunts at my home during the Easter. And I had 2 good friends who did not live in Liberty City, but we would go get them and bring them out so they could participate in the Easter egg hunt. And one year, the 3 of us went to my dad. They had a big glass plate window in the living room. So we went to the window to see where they were hiding the eggs. And of course, obviously, we got most of the eggs for that Easter egg. And everybody's like, how did you all know where these eggs? And we laughed about it. And then I think my mom walked in on us and said, what are you all laughing about? And one of my friends, I think it was Greg, said, well, we saw y'all where y'all were hiding all the eggs, and so we went out and got all the eggs. And of course, that was the last time that we, but that was just classic. That was classic.
In 50 years, what should we know about life in Liberty City?
Wow. I hope that some of the homeowners will either leave their homes to their children, and that their children will preserve their homes. I know in this day and time, a lot of younger people don't want to hold on to what we call quote unquote family homes. We're going to be in the same boat. My mom is 92, and even if she lives to be 100, that's only 8 years from now. And we're going to have to make a decision about the family home as well. I would hope that at some point, one of my siblings will move back to Savannah and maybe want to live in the home and refurbish it and what have you, so we can keep it in the family. But it's not often that people can say, I'm 70 years old, and say that I was around when my dad built our house from the ground up, and that house is still standing. Not too many, well, I should qualify, not too many black families can say that. A lot of white families in Savannah can point to a house that was built by their great-great-grandparents downtown Savannah in the 1800s or even the 1700s, and still it's in the family. But black families don't have that type of consistency in history. So I'm hoping that maybe that will happen to the homes out here in Liberty City.
Great note. Any last things you'd like to share with us?
No, I think I've shared a lot with you all that as I said, hopefully for historical purposes, people will review these and be able to realize what it was like growing up in Liberty City in the 1950s.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Certainly welcome.